America, the land of the free. But how did we become so great, you ask? Well, sit down and I'll tell you.
America. The story of how we became America in America, the United States. It all began in 1492 when the Spanish exploration party led by Christopher Columbus stepped foot upon America. Although seemingly insignificant, this small moment would spark one of the greatest colonization efforts the world has ever seen.
These early settlers were driven by the passion they held for God, gold, and glory. They were seeking new converts from the native people living there and had rumors of vast riches in the New World. Unfortunately, passion alone could not ensure the survival of the New World, as seen by the disappearing colony of Roanoke.
Fast forward to May 1607 in Jamestown, Virginia, where ambitious British settlers are about to take the first step in the gamble of their lives. Enticed by the previous successes found by the Spaniards, these men were ready and willing to risk their lives for a claim in the New World's riches.
This colony of Jamestown, however, would not be a failure. In the next few years, Jamestown would emerge as the first successful colony of Britain, a position they owe mostly to the production of tobacco, the first cash crop of America.
With some help from the natives living there, more and more colonies began to arise upon the eastern coast of this country. Planted near rivers, these new colonies quickly became economic powerhouses in their own way for Britain. Due to the lack of farmable land in the northern part of the country, New England colonies quickly developed strong industrialized economies based on logging and maritime trade. The middle colonies mostly followed in suit, although they focused a bit more on farming. On the other hand, the South was abundant in rich farmland and developed a lucrative economy based on cash crops and slavery.
These economic differences led to a diverse social demographic. Because the southern colonies had such a prominent agricultural society, slavery was heavily relied upon. This led to the creation of social barriers and eventually great racial unrest. It always gets me. The northern colonies consisted mostly of religious outcasts looking to escape religious persecution. They generally lived in tight-knit communities that supported schools and local churches. This sense of unity deterred monopolistic values from forming. The middle colonies took bits and pieces of both the northern and southern regions. They had both industrial and agricultural features and developed a society that was a mix of the two. Despite similarities, there were also many differences. Due to the ethnic diversity and amalgamation of cultures, tolerance for people of all backgrounds and religions was higher than in the rest of the country.
The famous Conestoga wagon was introduced by the German immigrants. This same group brought the long rifle to the Americas, obviously. Scottish and Irish immigrants brought their agricultural techniques to the Americas. With the growing population of colonists infringing on natives' land, a crisis was reaching its flashpoint.
Let's examine the causes of the French and Indian War. There were highly volatile disputes in the Ohio River Valley over the extremely fertile land. Additionally, French and English colonists often skirmished over minor issues such as borders and Native American trade rights. In the Battle of Fort Necessity, amateur tactician George Washington led his force of 400 British regulars in defense of Great Meadows, Pennsylvania. George Washington attempted to battle using European organized warfare. However, the French and their native allies used guerrilla warfare, and George Washington was forced to negotiate a truce. Despite the failures of this amateur tactician, Great Britain managed to overpower the French and their Native American allies, winning the war.
This war would drag Great Britain into significant debt and fuel the growing revolution in the colonies. It additionally led to an increased tax and military presence, ending the period of salutary neglect, and caused the implementation of the Proclamation Line, which prevented colonists from settling past the Appalachian Mountains. This action further angered the colonists, and overall, France's influence on the Northern American development was reduced.
We'll be right back with part 2.
America. The story of how we became America in America, the United States.
Welcome back. The end of salutary neglect and the introduction of the proclamation line contributed to further turmoil for Britain's economic powerhouse. Let's discuss this with local experts Esteban Campana and Carl Zeiss.
So Esteban, what exactly caused relations between Great Britain and the American colonies to become so hostile?
Well, the end of salutary neglect included enforcement of the Navigation Acts. This cut into the wealth of the powerful American businessman. In addition, Great Britain passed the Stamp Act, which taxed all printed paper. This set a standard that tax could be used to raise money instead of regulating commerce. The Proclamation Line of 1763 was also a factor. Preventing colonists from settling further in the Appalachian Mountains, this angered those who wanted to do so, or were already living beyond the boundary.
The Proclamation Line hauled expenses of the colony further west. Additionally, Enlightenment principles, a widespread ideology at the time, influenced the growing revolution through its individualistic ideals. In the colonist mind, these principles invoked the belief that the American colonies were just as important as the British Empire.
Not only were there minor events that urged the colonists to independence, there were a few major events that sort of sparked the revolution. Some of these events include the Intolerable Acts, the Boston Massacre, and the final straw, the Battle of Lexington and Concord. Here we have an expert on these events.
The Intolerable Acts were quite frankly intolerable. They include the Quartering Act, which legalized the right of British government to forcefully quarter soldiers without pay in citizens' houses. Another act included in the Intolerable Acts is the Boston Port Act, which closed the port of Boston until repayment from the Boston Tea Party, a scandalous act boycotting against the tax on tea. The Intolerable Acts were accompanied by British occupation of Boston in order to prevent rebellion. The Boston Massacre was a dreadful event in which British soldiers sought into a group of rioters in the streets of Boston. While the event itself was not necessarily the soldiers' fault, the propaganda that formed around the event caused the colonists to call for independence from Britain. Paul Revere created a famous depiction, which detailed bloodshed and an accompanying description causing disgust and fear to spread among the colonists. Attempts at diplomacy failed, and the British decided to subdue the rebellious American colonists. They attacked the colonial's militia arsenal and moved on to a skirmish at Concord. At these locations would be the start of a long war.
However, the colonists were not all trigger-happy, as some of them made efforts to stay loyal to Britain. The First Continental Congress was conceived in Philadelphia due to the desire to stay with Great Britain, and as such the Galloway Plan was the product of the greatest diplomatic minds of their time being put together. This plan would bring a colonial parliament to unite the colonies and an attempt to keep the benefits of staying with Britain, but also increase the overall autonomy of the colonies. This plan, however, was not to be executed uncontested. Radicals pushed another plan, the Suffolk Resolves. This plan would introduce boycotts and support colonial governments and militias. This would forcefully increase the autonomy of the colonies. This resolve led to the Boston Tea Party, as it was the pinnacle of espionage and boycotting combined into one. This party would increase tensions between colonies and Great Britain. The Suffolk Resolves were adopted by those of the First Continental Congress to be their course of action. In addition, after the battles of Lexington and Concord, a Second Continental Congress was called, also held in Philadelphia. This meeting was devoted to the separation between the colonies and Great Britain. They reconvened the diplomatic resources in the colonies in order to peacefully break away from Great Britain. This meeting led to the writing and signing of the Declaration of Independence in Philadelphia a year later.
The war ended in American victory and independence. No such revolution had ever been successful in the past. America's triumph over Great Britain showed to the entire world that revolutions were a viable option if diplomacy fails.
After the war, the people quickly learned that they needed a form of government that would be able to govern fairly and be representative of all people. As such, the political leaders brainstormed and came up with the Articles of Confederation, which gave power to the state government but had a central government loosely tied together. Those who created the Articles of Confederation worried that a strong central government would oppress the people, but they went to the other extreme. The central government actually had too little power.
America under the Articles of Confederation was simply put terrible. The central government had no real power and as such could not defend the rights of the citizens of a state if they were unfairly taxed or had injustices placed upon them. Additionally, the government required a supermajority to get anything done, and as such, no progress would be made, as most states were split on the issues that would come up. A two-thirds majority would almost never happen. Most importantly, the federal government could not levy taxes, and so in order to raise money, they were required to request money from the states. However, the states did not have to give up the money to the federal government, leaving the central government ultimately broke.
People quickly discovered the flaws in the Articles of Confederation and convened another convention in order to sort out the difficulties. This convention, known as the Constitutional Convention, was originally dedicated to modifying the Articles of Confederation. However, realizing that the Articles were fundamentally flawed, the attendees of the convention ultimately scrapped them entirely and drafted a new document, the Constitution. Though there were debates involving the Constitution, the attendees decided they needed an immutable document ensuring the natural rights of the citizens of their country. To fill this need, the Bill of Rights was created.
The Constitution increased the central government's power, as well as set forth the rights and responsibilities that the people would be given. At the time, people meant white, land-holding males, but due to civil rights movements, this definition would later be expanded to include every citizen of the United States. Additionally, the Constitution only required a supermajority under certain circumstances. Most laws to be passed only required a majority. Most importantly, it ensured that each part of the government, being executive, legislative, and judicial, had the power to overpower another branch in some aspects.
Ultimately, the revolution set the ability for other countries to successfully have revolutions. Additionally, the troubles with the Articles of Confederation showed the importance of a central government that is strong, able to perform its own duties without major restriction. In Part 3, we shall be discussing America after the Constitution had been applied.
We'll be right back with Part 3.
America. The story of how we became America in America. The United States. Hello. Last time you were here, we discussed the Revolutionary War and its effect on the United States. We also talked about the significance of the Constitutional Convention. A lot of important events occurred because of the convention, as the new government faced new and interesting challenges that would change the course of history in the United States forever. As discussed before, the new government was set up in a very balanced way. Here with us we have an expert on the United States government.
Yes, indeed. The government is a very complicated topic that makes sure to cover as many scenarios as possible. And, as such, the three-branch system was implemented. This included the legislative, judicial, and executive branches. The legislative branch passed laws. The judicial branch passed judgment on the laws and established ethical standards. And the executive branch held control of the military and could create, but not pass, ideas for laws.
Each branch could check each other in different aspects so that no one branch had sole power over the entire government. This system ensured that nothing adverse to the people's wishes would be implemented into the country's infrastructure. An example of this is that the executive branch could veto a potential law, and the legislative branch could, with a supermajority, pass the law anyway. However, the judicial branch could deem the bill unconstitutional. After the Constitution was ratified, the first order of business was electing the first president of the United States. The first president would have to accomplish many things and would have to have grace under pressure. This president was none other than amateur tactician George Washington. Remember him? This man would take the remains from the Revolution and piece them together. George Washington was one of the most important men in American history, as he set a wide range of precedents that would carry on to modern times.
George Washington set forth a number of important precedents. Some of the most common things in government today were created by Washington, and were carried on by each president afterwards. For example, the presidential cabinet was Washington's idea. He believed that if he surrounded himself with the smartest men to help him lead, he would be a successful leader. Additionally, the idea that the president only spends 2 terms in office is also an idea that Washington had, and has been continued to this day after Washington willfully stepped down from president after his 2nd term.
Not only did he set up political precedents, George Washington also dealt with the Whiskey Rebellion, which was about a whiskey tax, in a very intelligent and thought-out way. Instead of sending the army in to quell the rebellion against the whiskey tax, he sent in militia, citizen soldiers, and had the Whiskey Rebellion surrendering without much of a fight. This, coupled with the cabinet that he established, proved that the president would not be a tyrant. Washington willfully stepped down after only 2 terms of his office. John Adams, Washington's vice president, was the second President of the United States. His presidency, while not as renowned as Washington's, was also significant to the core of the United States. He was the first president who ran as part of a political party. The political parties were, at the time, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. The Federalists believed in a stronger central government, where the Democratic Republicans believed in a weaker central government with autonomous state governments. These parties battled it out politically until the Federalist party's collapse. John Adams' presidency is significant because of his replacing the Supreme Court with Federalists, making it easier for Adams to push a Federalist agenda through the Republican government and try to stall Jefferson's agenda. This is significant because this sort of political fighting became the basis of political fights to this very day, only with Democrats and new Republicans.
Thomas Jefferson was the third President of the United States and a co-founder of the Democratic Republicans. He was very significant to the infrastructure of the United States. He passed laws in favor of the ability for courts to rule decisions unconstitutional. This came from the Marbury versus Madison case, in which Jefferson appointed William Marbury to the Supreme Court. James Madison refused to deliver the appointment papers. But when Marbury complained to the Supreme Court, Chief Justice John Marshall ruled in favor of Madison by declaring part of the Judiciary Act of 1789 unconstitutional. This was a power grab in the Supreme Court and led to the continued tradition of the Supreme Court reviewing federal laws to check if they are unconstitutional.
Jefferson also decreased the national debt by cutting the budgets to the Army and Navy, and was well received because he also reduced taxes on the people. Jefferson's crowning achievement would be the Louisiana Purchase. France sold its control of the Louisiana Territory to the United States. It was a major power grab for the president, as the Constitution did not delegate the power to purchase land to the president. It also knocked France out of the New World completely, and over doubled the size of the United States.
The War of 1812. Some call it the Second American Revolution. This was the first war that America declared on its own as a nation. This war is incredibly important to the United States legacy. This war was chiefly caused by the British impressment of sailors into the Royal Navy. Britain was fighting a war with France and required sailors for its navy, so they took Americans from aboard American ships. To solve this issue, the President issued an embargo against Great Britain, but the embargo failed because of the reliance on British trade. Jefferson had to admit that the embargo was a failure, and it was lifted very shortly afterwards. The British continued impressment and supported Native American resistance to American expansion. Britain seemed to not recognize American citizenship or respect America as a whole nation. Seemingly left with no alternatives, America declared war on Britain.
After declaring war, America launched an invasion against Canada, which horribly failed and pushed American troops back into their own territory. Great Britain came to Canada's aid with veteran armies. These armies had just been fighting with Napoleon, and when Napoleon was defeated, these experienced troops were freed up to be used against America. After launching an offensive, British soldiers burned the capital, Washington, D.C., to the ground. This was a response to American arson in the failed invasion of Canada. While fighting continued, both sides eventually became exhausted of the war, and a treaty was signed in Ghent, Belgium. This treaty was rather creatively named the Treaty of Ghent. This war was called the Second American War of Independence because the fight was truly for recognition of American citizenship and respect for America as its own country. Additionally, if America had fallen and been crushed by Britain, the United States might have returned to British control.
The War of 1812 has huge significance in American history. It gave the United States a huge sense of nationalism as they fought back one of the world's biggest superpowers, and it gave credibility to being a citizen of the United States. Additionally, it showed that America could hold its own, declare war, and survive against a foreign power even greater than America itself. Well, there you have it. How we became America. From colonization to war to more war. Join me again in a few months, and I'll tell you all about the usage of liquid America in the Second Indochina War. Unfortunately, I'm not sure how to end.
It's the